Hello and welcome to this evening's Alumni College webinar, The Business of Climate Change, co-sponsored by the Brandeis University Alumni Association and the Asper Center for Global Entrepreneurship at the Brandeis International Business School. Thank you for joining us. We are pleased to welcome our special guests, Carly Greenberg, Brandeis Class of 2011 and Brandeis MA Class of 2012 with Environmental Sustainability and Environmental, Social, and Governance, ESG, reporting at the Hershey Group, and Robert Brown, Brandeis University Class of 1988 and Brandeis MA Class of 1989, founding partner at Atlas Impact Partners. Our session is moderated by Professor Ben Gomes-Casseres, Brandeis University Class of 1976 and Brandeis Parent of the Class of 2015. Professor Gomes-Casseres is the Peter A. Petri Professor of Business and Society and Director of the Asper Center for Global Entrepreneurship. Thank you all for being part of this discussion, and with that, we will begin with Professor Gomes-Casseres. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much, and welcome to all my friends who are alums from my years and alums from other years, and those of you who are not alums. Welcome to Brandeis, and welcome to this session. So, Daniel, I just want to be sure that the Zoom stuff is going to work. I now have my screen share. You can see the opening slide, and then the three of us, I think, are visible, hopefully, to
That's correct, yes.
Audience. Okay, excellent. Well, welcome all of you to our classroom. And welcome back, Rob Brown and Carly Greenberg, back to Brandeis. This is a group of alums. The three of us are now across years. Rob 88, I'm 76, Carly 11, and we look forward to discussing with you in our audience some of the really important issues that I think face all of us in society. So what I'd like to do is, instead of beginning with an introduction, which I will, ask our speakers to introduce themselves a little bit more in a minute. Their bios are online, and you will be able to get this PowerPoint afterwards, so you can certainly follow up on some of what you see here. But if I may, I'd like to do a little professorial thing and frame these issues a little bit for you. The topic is called Business of Climate Change, but it is much bigger than that. And we are now at a juncture in our society that is, I think, very important and big. Before we get there, let me just say Brandeis is doing the best it can in many ways in terms of climate action. These points that you see here were given to me by Mary Fisher, our Director of Sustainability, terrific sustainability program on campus. And we are signatory in the global commitments that colleges signed to. We're developing a new climate action plan that will have specific steps that we hope Brandeis will be able to take in the next 10 years. And we've done some things in the last year. What you see there, one of the bullets says New Skyline Residence Hall. For those of you in my year, that's the castle. The castle has been transformed now, and the piece of it that is totally new is heated by geothermal, and it's electrified. It's really quite good. So that's a little bit of the local Brandeis scene, but we're really talking about a much larger issue, obviously, when we talk about climate change. And at Brandeis, or more specifically at the business school, so I'm at the International Business School, and we have been addressing this, specifically this particular spring. We had a week planned on climate change issues. Now that week was exactly April 30th through, May 30th through April 3rd. And you know what that is? That's when COVID hit Boston. And so everything went online, and we had to basically regroup ourselves. But we were able to continue with some of what we did, which is that in many of our classes, we were able to incorporate climate change issues as regards the business, economics, and finance topics of that class. So we had a lot of speakers. We did have a terrific opening night with Tom Friedman, which was canceled. So that hopefully will be something we hope to be able to do in some form in spring of next year. So please be on the tune, look out for that. But the topic we have is the business of climate change, which is how does business affect and can improve climate change? And the problem is basically one that we all know well. This is just a very dramatic picture.
Ben, sorry to interrupt. You're still on the title slide. It's not advancing.
Oh, really? It's not advancing. Oh, that's terrible. I'm sorry about that. You're not seeing anything advancing. That's bad. I'm sorry about that. What are you seeing now?
There we go.
Now we see your slides.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so, okay, I'm not repeating the lecture, but we rushed through this slide and then the climate education at the business school slide. Is that there?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. What we now see is a global temperature chart change. You see that? Just to be sure we're working. Okay, thank you. All right, so I really don't want to spend too much time on this, except to say that the crisis that we have in climate and the urgency that we have in climate has been obviously enveloped now by another crisis, the COVID-19 crisis. I hope you see that slide now. Did that move okay, Daniel? Thank you. And then that obviously creates a tremendous social, healthcare, livelihood upheaval in our world. So what used to be sort of climate issues in some sense took a back seat as we have to fight the health crisis. And then now we have another hugely important movement, another Black man murdered that is sparking another movement, which some of us may remember movements in the 60s. This is bigger and more important. So I think all of these crises are enveloping each other. And when we talk about business and social responsibility, we can't just talk about climate change anymore. We're also talking about the health crisis, and we're talking about the social injustice and the racial injustice issues that we're facing now. All of that gets piled upon an economy that has seen great disparities of income increase since the time that at least I was here in college. And we're back to sort of the Great Depression or the Roaring 20s when Louis Brandeis spoke out against big business at the time. So we have a very difficult situation economically, almost a renewal of our social contract because of all these challenges that I think are coming to a head. And what we're going to do today is to talk a little bit about, with experts, about the responses that business has had or can have to these kinds of issues. And the kinds of responses that business have, they fall into these 5 categories, and there may be more, but traditionally philanthropy, corporate social responsibility, CSR, the triple bottom line approach, and ESG investing, which is something we'll talk about a little bit more, and social impact investing. So we're delighted to have really experts in at least the last 2 parts of this on the panel who are going to walk us through it. This is a little chart from Carly's work. Carly is a thought leader in the area of ESG investing, and particularly in the application of the UN Sustainable Development Goals to ESG. This is from a paper she wrote. Again, the link will be available to you. But what you see from that is when we say the word ESG, we mean 3 things. We mean environmental issues, social issues, and governance issues. Governance in particular around how companies are governed, but I think also in a way how society is governed. So these are the agenda points sort of for today. And what I'd like to do is really start with asking our panelists a little bit to kind of reflect on how they got from here to there, from there then to now, from Brandeis to the work in social responsibility that they're doing now. Then we'll talk a little bit about what ESG is, or social impact investing, and how those work. And then very specifically, the question of environment. So how can business affect or help in a way with climate change? And then how can business affect and help with the social injustice, the S part of ESG? And we will have time for your questions. We hope to have some of your ideas and have a free-flowing discussion is really what my hope is. So the introductions formally, I think, were given. I would just say that Rob Brown is just steeped in the area of investment and investment for justice. He has worked in this through various companies before, had his own research, and then his own company now, asset management company, that focuses on social impact investing. Carly Greenberg is another one steeped in ESG investing on the side of how to evaluate these. And she worked for an activist asset management firm that took action on these things in the boardrooms. And finally, well, I teach about some of these things, and I hope to just keep our conversation flowing. So I'm going to just now stop the screen share. We really don't need that anymore. Daniel, have I gotten rid of it properly? Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
you're good.
Okay, Rob and Carly, it's us, and welcome to my dorm room. Let's talk
a lot nicer than my dorm room ever.
Yeah, hey, it got upgraded a little bit in the last 45 years. I mean, as I said, you know, we are in such a juncture today, and you both are doing such important work in this area of business social responsibility, generally speaking. Can you just briefly tell us sort of the milestones or the most important things, like from Brandeis to what you do now? And we'll definitely get into what ESG means and the broader issues that we go. But maybe Rob, if maybe I can ask you to just tell us a little bit about where you started and where you are now.
Sure. Thank you, Ben, and thanks for having me here. So I always believe that a view towards socially conscious investing is really a reflection of one's own socially conscious mindset. And I honestly can say that that is something that I was taught at a very early age. It's not something you learn professionally. It's not something you learn at school. My parents used to teach us that if there was one thing you do in this world before you leave it, you should find a way to make it better. And that was taught to us at home. It was taught to us when I was sitting on a hard bench on Saturday mornings in shul, right? It was you know, part of how I grew up. Now, the transition, obviously, from that set of personal values to a professional life really did begin at Brandeis. It was where, you know, I learned that having those sets of behaviors was common to lots of other people, and where I learned that, you know, you could express your views and feel comfortable with those views amongst your peers. I will also say that I was trained very well at the business school now, what then was just the International Economics program at the Lemberg School. But I was trained as an econometrician. And that skill set of sort of understanding empirically how things work and understanding how to analyze things empirically has been an important transition point from my professional career as an investor to my professional career as, let's call it, a socially conscious investor. Because one of the issues that I think is written, and hopefully that we talk about today, that's really lacking in the world of, you know, whether it's ESG or impact investing or values-based investing, is the idea that you're supposed to do so with a sort of level of rigor. You know, the folks who say, we have to do this now, I don't think are understanding the full picture, because investors don't allocate capital just because someone tells them they have to do this now. They invest capital because there's a return. Now, you can do that with a socially conscious mindset, and you can do that intentionally with a purpose, but no one does it just because, you know, someone said you're supposed to. Now, in between, you know, where I started life and here, there's a lot of steps. We could talk about those, but those are really the driving forces behind what led me here, right? An empirical mindset that I learned at Brandeis, and something that I was taught at a very young age by my family and my friends.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you, Robert. I mean, that really is this kind of synthesis that I think Brandeis reaches for at its best days. Is the heart and the mind and the science that you're bringing to your work today. Mm-hmm. Carly, you actually came also through a BA/MA program, just like Rob did, except when you were with us, it was already now a business school, but again, similar kind of path. So tell us how you got from then to now.
Sure, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. So, much like Rob, my pathway into this ESG sustainable business world also began at Brandeis. But when I matriculated to Brandeis, I actually very firmly believed I was going to be a lawyer. And so my path going to where I am now actually started when I was a sophomore. I took an environmental law class with Professor Laura Golden. And over the course of that year, basically the environmental part stuck and the law part didn't. And it was actually through Professor Laura Golden's Earth Notes listserv that I got my first opportunity in ESG investing. So at that point, to be an environmental studies minor, you needed to have an internship in environmental, you know, the environmental universe. And I was also an econ major. And so this opportunity came across the listserv for a analyst opportunity at this firm called KLD Research and Analytics. And it was essentially an ESG research role. And it was my first foray into the field. And after stepping into it, I immediately caught religion. I thought it was the best thing since sliced bread. And I luckily got into it when I was a sophomore. So I was able to gear the rest of my studies towards really making myself as competitive of a candidate as possible in this ESG investing world. So after that, I felt pretty confident about my my environmental and social justice street cred, but I felt I was lacking in the finance street cred. So I fell pretty heavily for the remainder of my time into financial studies. I pursued the MA-IEF, as you just mentioned. I also, right after I finished grad school, sat for all 3 levels of the Chartered Financial Analyst designation and the CFA charter holder now. And basically started working at Boston Trust Walton when I was a rising senior, and was with them for close to a decade. And then an opportunity opened up for me to jump to an in-house position at a company. So I am now working on ESG issues for a Fortune 500 chocolate company. And here I am today.
Wonderful. Well, and that's another one of these perfect Brandeis sort of career paths in a way, right? You followed your heart and you combined it with the rigorous study that you got here, and that's been working. So you two are going to solve the world's problems for us now, right?
With help, with other people's help.
Okay, so help us understand in the audience and myself, what is this ESG investing? And we hear that word, and I know social impact investing is Rob, the way that's fine. Whatever it is, let's define what it is, and then we'll see whether how this works. So what is it? I mean, Carly, since you wrote the book on this and that I quoted, so maybe I'll start you with a little quick definition of what you think this is about, and then Rob, please.
Sure. Well, so, and I'm sure Rob will touch on this too. One of the biggest challenges within the ESG investing and the ESG business area is that there is just a problem of linguistics. We really have a crisis of too many acronyms, and then also people really disagreeing on what those acronyms mean. So I personally subscribe to the methodology or the mindset that ESG is a big tent, and SRI, sustainable responsible impact investing, is also a big tent. There are people who see a lot of daylight between those. So you'll encounter folks who will say, no, SRI investing means only this, and ESG investing means only this. But broadly, what I think is in that big tent is people who are looking to allocate capital for social good, as well as people who are looking to just utilize what is out there and take a broader view of their investments to limit risk and make better investment decisions. So ESG investing, most broadly, is the incorporation of environmental, social, and governance considerations into your investment decision making. So that could be negative screening. So maybe you don't like how a company is acting on ESG issues, and so you don't want to invest in it. It could be positive screening. And it could also, again, be taking a more sophisticated view on the risk and potentially using that with an asset allocation mindset. So it's a big tent. There are many, sisters who live within that tent. So impact investing, social impact investing, and so I'll head off to Rob to continue the discussion. Yeah.
So let me just add to that, Carly. Also, there's activism involved, right? Investor activism, which is what Walden did. Can you just briefly say what that's about?
Sure. So Walden participated in this practice called shareholder engagement or active shareholder engagement. And essentially, if you went to business school, or even if you took a business course, there is this concept that if you own equity in a company, you are a company's owner. You technically are an owner, you're a shareholder. And so there are rights imbued to you as a shareholder, and one of which is that you have the right to have access to management, and you have the right to engage with management, to talk to them about practices that you would like to see done better, done differently, continued. And so Walden would have engagements with the management of the companies that were in our clients' portfolios and encourage them to adopt better ESG practices, better ESG policies, to become more transparent, and so on and so forth. So just to give an example, while at Walden, I oversaw our LGBT equality engagement. And so I would write to companies that were in our portfolio who didn't have a publicly accessible non-discrimination policy, or maybe did have an accessible non-discrimination policy, but it was lacking explicit recognition of sexual orientation and gender identity. And I would write to them and ask them to expand their non-discrimination policy so all employees would know that they were welcome there and would not be discriminated against.
Wonderful. I mean, that's good to hear. I mean, the word activism had a different ring for us in the 1960s, but I see the effect that it has, and this is part of the way business works on this topic. So, Rob, let me throw it to you. Again, we've talked about ESG, social impact investing, and you are in the business of really allocating capital in many ways, and you were also involved at Brandeis in our asset management group and on the committee that reviews the endowment of Brandeis. So, how do you think about these criteria for investment and your work?
Well, I've always thought that the criteria isn't as important as a criteria, just for starters. I think it's, as Allison said, Carly said, it's a very big tent, and there's room for lots of different views. I do think one of the issues that is challenging today is that there's not a lot of appropriate measurement of what's going on. So people are sort of free to make statements that a lot of folks would call greenwashing, for example. And I think that has to change. But I do think fundamentally that it's a big tent. We, at my firm, ascribe to a philosophy of investing called impact investing. Now for us, what's most important, what's dominant there is the product or service that the company creates and sells to the world, and what that product or service does to generate change in the world or to mitigate externalities in the world. So perhaps an example is, we invest in manufacturing companies that create solar inverters, which essentially is the technology that converts unstable sunlight into stable AC current. That company does one thing. It does one thing only. And our view is that that is a very important contribution to the mitigation of climate risk. We go so far as to say, okay, if that company didn't exist, what would the world look like? So we try and measure what is the improvement that a company is making versus some counterfactual. Now, in the case of environmental externalities, it's pretty straightforward because you can measure what's the kilowatt hours of the installed base of solar inverters. And you can then ask the question, if those kilowatt hours were produced by a traditional carbon-based energy company, what would be the emissions? And the differential, of course, is what we would consider to be the impact. Environmental solutions are the most obvious, but there are also others, in the health and wellness space. There are lots of companies that we think are creating innovative technologies to help you solve human health problems. And on the short side of our book, because we are a long short hedge fund, we like to find things like diesel engine manufacturers. We like to find things, like companies that are creating the pumps to put pressure down a well to push natural gas out, which of course creates fluid and effervescence that pollutes the earth.
Those are your short sells.
Now, to your point about allocating capital, I think it's also important to note that we don't just say that this company is doing something good or that company is doing bad. That is certainly how we define it as a part of our investable universe. But once it's in our universe, our job is then to create capital allocation decisions that generate revenue or return for our investors. And that's where we become just hard-nosed investors, right? Like everybody else. And make decisions about, who we're going to invest in and who we're going to short.
Yeah. So this is great. I mean, both of you are doing, important work in that slice of the investment world and the business world. How can we widen the lens now and ask the question of what impact can business have on the climate issues that we face? And we're talking about a type of investment which maybe it's a small slice or maybe it's a big slice, I don't know. But I mean, Rob, let me just stay with you on this. How big are the flows that you're seeing given these criteria, and do you think they'll have some kind of measurable impact, or what else should we think about in terms of the role of business in mitigating and improving and helping climate change?
Well, I think we have to be careful when we answer the question about capital flows.
Okay.
Because if you speak to any of the large mutual fund companies, for example, they will tell you that there's several tens of trillions of dollars going towards socially conscious investing. That's typically because they've all signed something called the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investing, which is, you know, it's a nice thing. We ascribe to it. We think it's important, but it's a pretty easy thing to decide to ascribe to. It basically says, I'm going to do my best efforts and I'm going to integrate these kinds of issues into my investment strategy. There's not a lot of rigor there. I think it's much more important to look to companies like Hershey's, where Carly is, and see that they have actually gone to the extent of mapping all of their efforts along these avenues, right? These, whether it's environmental, social, or governance, or I think, I don't want to speak for her, but you know, they map it all to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and they've actually said this is what we do along each one of these axes, right? And they discuss it in a report that they released. That kind of standard, holding yourself to that higher standard, I think is very important and much more rare. So that's a long introduction to the answer to your question. How much capital flows are really going towards authentic, dedicated, socially conscious efforts? I don't have the right number. It's far less than people claim it is. And it is certainly growing. It's in the billions. But it's not really moving the capital allocation needle yet.
Okay, important to know that. At the same time, what you mentioned, which Carly maybe can pick up on this, is that it's not just those investment flows, it's what companies are doing internally that could either be helpful or not helpful, right? So Carly, you're, I think, at Hershey, is that part of what you do, is to help them tweak their business operations, or how does that work from inside the company?
Yeah, well, let's talk broadly at the question that you first posed to us, which is what impact can businesses have on climate change? So I actually have 3 thoughts in terms of where business can be really, really impactful when it comes to climate change. The first, and this is largely related to what I'm doing right now at Hershey, is businesses can themselves hold themselves to climate science. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been working on proper climate modeling, and basically has developed a pretty comprehensive carbon budget that they say all of society, businesses, humans, governments, have to stay within that carbon budget. Otherwise, you know, for lack of a better word, we're all screwed. And so businesses are a huge part of that recipe. And so right now I am working for Hershey on setting the company's science-based greenhouse gas reduction goal. And essentially what that is we are looking at where are we today for our baseline, and where do we need to be in a given future deadline. So by 2050, by 2075, how much carbon are we allowed to emit to stick within the global carbon budget? And so that's one way that companies can really have an impact on climate. I would say, you know, companies have been setting carbon reduction goals for years. The way you can kind of think of a normal carbon reduction goal versus a science-based reduction goal is a normal carbon reduction goal often has been set by a company just picking a number that sounds good, or a company picking a number that they thought was achievable. A science-based target really flips the paradigm, and it makes the question not what can we do, but what does the world need us to do? And so that's one aspect that a company can do. The second aspect is that companies themselves are big spenders. You know, capital expenditures from companies can be quite significant. And so companies have a history of supporting CapEx for renewable energy projects, which itself has actually been able to reduce the pricing of renewable energy technology so that it's more accessible for others. And so I think company CapEx to support emerging technologies, as well as to provide large scale demand for renewable energy projects, because you still do need a large off-taker for most renewable energy projects to get enough seed funding to be approved. And so that's another aspect where companies can have a big impact. And the final aspect, and I think this is one that is often missed, and it was something that we focused on a lot at Boston Trust Walden, is companies themselves can also be a big advocate for public policy on climate change. So there are a lot of companies out there that are advocating now for a price on carbon, or at least saying that, you know, there's, for years, the companies who benefit from climate change not being regulated have been the most active in public policy spheres. And hopefully within, you know, starting now, hopefully, but going forward, hopefully we see that starting to shift, and companies that would benefit from having stronger climate policies are going to be a bit more vocal.
Cool. Well, let me pick up on that.
Ben, can I jump in here for a
yes,
second?
please. Yeah, we'll come back.
It's also really important to ask the question, what can investors and consumers do? And I think the answer to that is hold companies accountable for the truth in what they're doing. So for example, you look to a company like British Petroleum, right? Now you look at all of their materials, they're all green. They've got that nice sun, right? It's yellow and green that they put up on all of their materials to their pumps across the world. And they will tell you that in 2018, they spent $500 million of CapEx on renewable energy projects, which sounds like a lot of money, right? Except when you ask the question, what's their total CapEx budget, which was $16 billion. So we're talking about something like 3% of their CapEx budget for a company that says things like they are enabling the energy transition, they are reimagining energy, right? This is the language that they use. And for a company that has committed to have net zero carbon emissions. Now, they've said by 2050, you don't need to be a genius to know that that's 30 years from now, right? But that to me is an example of greenwashing that we shouldn't stand for.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, you could look to a company like Cummins Diesel Engine, which likes to say that they spent $15 million on solar panels so that they could generate solar energy to support their operations. And now look at how much carbon they've put into the earth just by producing the products that they produce. Never mind the diesel engines themselves once they're installed, right? It's 808,000 million tons of CO2. That's a lot of pollution. So for them to claim that they're doing something good for the world is a little disingenuous. And I think we as investors in particular, because we focus on these issues, need to hold them accountable. Mm-hmm. And I think as consumers, maybe you want to think twice before you go to a British Petroleum pump next time you fill up your gas tank.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully.
Okay. Yeah. That well taken. Carly, I think we'll still eat chocolate though. But you're
all of Hershey chocolate as of January is sustainable and certified. Or sorry, I should say certified sustainable.
Certified by Carly Greenberg, Brandeis University. That's how I would say.
More by Rainforest Alliance and people who know what they're doing in that regard. But yeah.
Well, listen. So I think take what we're just discussing, and now can we add on to it the important other component, the ESG social part, and that is just on fire now. I mean. And I think for the right reasons, people have thought about climate issues not in the abstract, but also in the way they affect communities. And the poorer communities and the poorer countries in the world are probably the ones that are going to be hit hardest and already are being hit hardest. And so I think in a way what COVID did to us and now Black Lives Matter movement has continues to show and teach us is that these communities are the front line. In many ways. And so how do we think about ESG and social investing and the role of business as affecting and improving social injustice as a related factor to climate, but also on its own? Carly, let me just stay with you on that, because I think that the UN goals, many of them were in some sense social goals, social economic goals, and maybe that's a good place to start. What's your sense for what business can do on the social justice front?
Yeah, it's a great question, and especially as it relates to climate change. So it used to be very common for the E, the S, and the G of ESG to be sort of siloed, to be their own little bench. And especially following COP24, the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, there emerged this concept called a just transition, which is as you are moving towards a low carbon economy, you can't leave people behind. And so especially with COVID-19, there's been a lot of clamoring from the investment community, as well as some businesses, as well as some civil society groups to, when we restart our economy, to do so in a way that is climate smart. But in terms of what businesses can be doing to support social justice, I would say quite a lot. And so if you think about it, where are the pockets in which businesses could affect people and could help either widen social justice gaps or close them? And it's with their own employees, it's with the people who are within their supply chain, and it's the people who are within the communities in which they operate. For some companies, this also includes their customers. I'm not in a company where our chocolate really is helping to widen or narrow the social justice gap with our customers. So I'm going to focus on those other three institutions. And so I think really thinking comprehensively about where are we hurting our employees or our supply chain partners, and where are we benefiting them, and how can we do more good, and where can we narrow where we're doing bad is really an important question for all companies to ask. And Rob mentioned Hershey's SDG report, and that report is doing just that. It's a very honest look at, here's where we are today, here's the risk we have, here's what we're trying to do to narrow those risks, and watch as we go through this journey. Hershey's done some really great work, especially within cocoa growing communities. So cocoa growing communities are known to have systemic problems with human rights abuse, specifically child labor. Deforestation is another key consideration too, which is, both social justice and environmental issue. And so all those issues are really symptoms of a bigger issue, which is poverty. And so Hershey has instituted a very smart program, and I don't really work on it. I just get to report about it. But the program is called Cocoa for Good. And what it is doing is it's trying to address poverty head on, while also trying to address those symptoms so that we could really root out all of these key issues that are really plaguing the supply chain, so that both, and it's on the business side, it's so that our supply chain stays healthy and we can stay in business for another 125 years. But then when you think of the human side, these are real life impacts that are occurring for cocoa farmers, the thousands of cocoa farmers that are our partners in bringing our delicious treats to the public.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah. I mean, so it's in the supply chain, and in some sense, it's good business too, in the sense of the sustainability of your supply chain. Also, I take it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Rob, what's your sense of this? The social part of the ESG kind of goals.
So I think, historical context is always important. Mm-hmm. And the movement towards socially conscious investing actually started with a farming consultant, which not everybody knows, but it was a guy named Moses who was talking to his boss. And his boss told him in Leviticus 19 that
I was wondering if you were going there.
Yeah, where are you? Did this happen? No, thank you.
that when you reap your harvest, you should leave the corners of the field for the poor and the strangers in the land. Yeah. This is a concept that goes back as long as humankind. Yeah. What can companies do? I think they can heed the words of Justice Brandeis, who said that we can have a democracy or we can have concentrations of great wealth, but we cannot have both. You want to solve poverty in America? Treat people fairly and pay them well. Now, well doesn't have to be excessive, but well ought to be a living wage for anyone who's on your payroll. And what we've seen, of course, is this shift away from human capital, right, towards other means of capital. You could call it either money or actual physical capital. And I think that has to revert back. The scales have to tilt a bit, and it's only companies that can do that, right? Unless we mandate a living wage through policy, which isn't a bad idea, companies have to take the mantle, and some have. Yeah. But I think that's what companies need to do. And by the way, I say that as someone who cares an awful lot about corporate profitability. and I'm certain you can have both, right? Yeah. You can have high degrees of profitability and you can pay your workers well.
Yeah, well, you bring up Louis Brandeis, which I mean, he lived in that earlier phase of the inequality that I showed that chart from, and of course he was very suspicious and against the power of big business. So what do you think about bigness? Did businesses get too big in the sense that the power they have is basically determining our social contract, including things like racial injustice and things like externalities of in the environment. So what's your position on bigness? I guess a la Louis Brandeis.
Shy away from.
Stay with Rob on that. Say again.
Sorry, Ben.
Go ahead.
I shy away from a concept of too big. I think what's important is a balance between the size of your company and the impact you have and the externalities that you create and the constituents that you're trying to serve, whether those are investors, employees, or your consumers. That's what's really important. When I was at an organization called Just Capital, which is in a sense an ESG ratings platform. It's not quite that, but you could put it in that group. We did a lot of very deep research work to ask the question through surveys, what does the American public believe is a just company? What are just, meaning ethical behaviors of a company? And then we ranked those companies, the largest companies in America, based on those set of values. And I'll tell you, some of the companies were pretty pleased with the results, but a lot of them were sort of forced to stand up and account for themselves and ask themselves, am I really serving my constituencies equally well? And is that the path to profitability? And I think companies are starting to talk a lot about it. They're not all starting to act well about it.
Yeah. Carly, what's your thought about that? What's a just company? I mean, that's quite a concept.
Yeah. Well, it is quite a big concept. I actually wanted to respond though to your question about bigness and what has happened and whether big corporations have kind of ruined America, or even just global capital markets writ large. And so one thing I actually approached in that 2017 paper that you showed the Venn diagram from is this issue of things that investors would call systemic risk, which are risks that don't necessarily affect any one particular company, but affect the entire market. So it's non-diversifiable risk. You can have a perfectly diversified portfolio and it's still going to affect you. And I think there are ESG issues that can be called non-diversifiable risk. And I bring them up because I think large companies, while for each individual one, some of these risks may have not necessarily been material, I think that there's been an issue of a tragedy of the commons that has arisen. So I think climate change is certainly one of those large systemic non-diversifiable risks. And I think inequality is another one. So while every company doesn't necessarily really tip the balances on inequality, they can make choices that can either widen that gap by paying most of their employees a fraction of what the CEO gets, or they could have more equitable compensation structures. And so I think I like where Rob was going in terms of this holding companies accountable. And I think the beauty is that a lot of people started watching. So now we live in a high, the Twitterverse exists. It's easy to call companies out on things. And so companies now are being held to a higher standard because there are more people watching. There's the adage, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And these days it's very easy for things to come to the sunlight, which I think has created a bigger onus on companies to right their behavior. And so I think, to get back to your question of what is a just company, I think a just company is one that is willing to be transparent, is one that listens to its stakeholders, and is one that is willing to change as they learn more and more information.
Well, may we have more of those given what you're doing, maybe we will. I want to turn a little bit to some of the questions that we've been getting on the chat that I'm getting here. And let me interpret a couple of them. One of them has to do with the chocolate supply chain. I guess, Carly, this would be for you, but it has to do with what goes to the farmer, what comes to the company. The way I think about it in a strategy view is that we do have a social contract here, and all along the supply chain we have transactions, and somewhere profitability gets allocated and gets captured. So how do we think about the parts that get captured? And some of the inequality measures suggest that capital is capturing more and more, labor is capturing less. And in this case, it would be an international question in terms of the chocolate supply chain. So we could talk about the chocolate supply chain, but if you want to comment more broadly about who's capturing the value that's being created by capitalism, that would be a big question. So Carly.
That would be a big question. I think I am going to answer it a bit more narrow in terms of what Hershey is doing. So Hershey, I mentioned Cocoa for Good. So Cocoa for Good is a commitment to invest $500, to basically $500 million in our cocoa supply chain by 2030. And basically a lot of those investments are going to the farmer to help them. I mentioned that this program is about trying to attack poverty head on. And so a lot of those investments are related to upscaling women farmer skills, to diversifying incomes, to improving cocoa yields so that people can sell more of their crop. Even fun things like training cocoa farmers on how to make chocolate. A lot of cocoa farmers actually have never tried chocolate, and just training them how to make that finished good allows them to both sell the commodity as well as the finished good. you're totally right. In the capitalist structure, there has been a ton of middlemen that have oftentimes, whittled down the profits that are seen as cocoa is sold up the supply chain. Hershey, as I mentioned earlier, has 100% of its cocoa as of January 2020 is certified sustainable. So part of that certification is related to equitable payments. But beyond that too, Hershey at the beginning of this year announced a new commitment, which is that a lot of cocoa is sourced by large companies like Hershey, Mars, Mondelez, et cetera. It's sourced by them through what's called mass balance sourcing. So that means, cocoa goes from farmer A, B, C, D, all the way through Z and ends up in a big pot. And then when the company gets it, they can't actually tell whether it came from farmer B or farmer Z or farmer V. And so Hershey made a commitment that by 2025, we are going to have all direct sourcing cocoa for Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. So any cocoa that we buy in those two countries, which are our highest risk zones within our supply chain, we are going to know the farmers that are our suppliers. Currently, we have 21% transparency into who our farmer is, which is pretty good. And we're just trying to get better. So hopefully they answered the question.
Yes, well,
it went micro instead of macro, but
no, that's great. But you also showed the value of transparency and that sunlight that makes it visible and therefore drives your actions. Let me Rob, let me try to bring in another question that comes in. It's related to food again, but the direct question is, how do consumers or investors influence the market change to build stores in nutrition deprived communities? Let me broaden that question for you a little bit. How do we as investors and perhaps as consumers actually steer what companies decide is their goal? Like, do they go to nutrition deprived communities or not? Do they go to places where their healthcare is needed or not? Right? Is that a pure profit calculation, or can we steer that? Can we help companies do the right thing in that sense?
Well, the best thing a consumer can do is vote with their pocketbook. And the only way to do that is to get informed about what the companies are doing. And the only way to do that is to demand that the companies are giving us information that's reliable and credible. There's a lot of smoke that gets blown around, and a lot of talk about programs that are accessing underprivileged neighborhoods, programs that are accessing food supply chains in the right way, and I have no doubt that Hershey is, but there are others that are not. And I think we as investors need to demand better disclosure of information. Now, there's a whole conversation we could have about the quality of that information as it's disclosed, but I think consumers have to make wise choices and be informed. To do that, investors have to demand better information. I think the two go hand in hand.
So it's that information and transparency. I link that maybe to another question that's being asked. There's a couple of different versions of this question, which is, what are the actionable steps that consumers can take? I think you addressed some of that. And related to that, what is the success rate of these shareholder proposals that try to improve practices over the objection of management? Maybe Rob, let me stay with you on that and go back to Carly on that. How active and successful is that route of change?
Well, I think we've sort of got to talk about past, current, and future.
Okay.
In the past, clearly, most shareholder proposals have kind of been pushed aside. No doubt about that. But I think a watershed moment was really I think it was 2018, when ExxonMobil shareholders decided that ExxonMobil would be held to the standard of the Paris Accords, even though the United States government decided to withdraw. That, to me, was a very important moment for shareholder advocacy. And I think the more shareholders make proposals that are supported by a large base of investors and the public, because believe me, companies pay attention to what their consumers want, the faster this evolution will happen. So what can you do as a consumer? Right? Spend your dollars, demand more from your company, and make sure as an investor you know it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And hope that the companies maintain these goals that they say they have and don't drop them at a moment's notice. There is a question which...
I have to chime in on the shareholder proposal. Yeah, I do, because I filed them. I've filed so many shareholder proposals. And I would say...
And we vote on them.
Thank you. Well, I don't file them anymore, but thank you for voting on the ones I used to file. So I would say Americans often think, and I think it's, it's a winner take all type culture, that if something gets below 50%, it loses. And most shareholder proposals do get below 50%, but that's not the goal. We're not shooting for a high vote rate, we're shooting for change. And so I will say that shareholder proposals are a very valuable tool for shareholders to be able to affect change at companies. Oftentimes at Boston Trust Walden, actually every time at Boston Trust Walden, we would start off an engagement through writing a letter, through seeking a dialogue. And sometimes the company gives you that dialogue, but they kind of pigeonhole you, or sometimes they just completely ignore you and your letter ends up in the circular file. And so filing a shareholder proposal, just the action of filing it, really does elevate the concern to the level of the board, which means there's more eyeballs and the company has more pressure to do something on it. A shareholder proposal getting above 30% of the vote, while by most of America's minds that's a losing proposal, that gets eyeballs too, because it means a third of your shareholders, a third of your shares want to see this change, and that is a significant number to pay attention to. And then beyond that too, if a proposal actually does get above 50% and the company does nothing on it, then there's more teeth that come out, because then you have proxy advisory firms, which are firms that produce research that encourage and also help direct fund advisors on how they should vote their proposals. They actually start voting against your board. They recommend that is a failure of governance if you are not listening to your shareholders, and you should no longer be on the board, which really gets companies' attention. So I have a different view from Robert, that I think shareholder proposals can be quite effective, not at every company, but certainly at a lot of companies.
And while we're talking about governance here, Ben, there's a pretty important distinction that I think people should be aware of when you're thinking about a company's pursuit of these issues. Ask the fundamental question, where does this issue lie in terms of responsibility in the management team? Who does that management person report to? And then who on the board is held accountable for making sure that these, let's call it, issues get driven down through the company? So, many times what you'll see is the person who's responsible for environmental impact is reporting to chief counsel. That's an organizational structure that has no teeth whatsoever. However, if that person reports to someone in the C-suite, and that person in the C-suite is incented, and you can read all this in the company's filings, with very specific targets to achieve very specific goals, that's a whole different kind of seriousness of mission at a company. And as investors and consumers, that's what you should be looking for, right? You should look at all the information you can find to understand, is this company serious, or are they just writing about things in their annual report?
Well, terrific. I think that there were a couple of questions that both of you touched on here, so I will go over them, having to do with, will companies maintain this commitment in a time of crisis when, they might have to be doing something else for their economic survival.
Well, the smart ones, particularly in the consumer discretionary space, are pressing their foot on the gas.
Are they?
Yeah, because they understand that this is not a passing phase in America. This is a real moment in time, and they can either, frankly, as capitalists, they can take advantage of it and change the way they behave to attract more consumers, which is what they should do, in my opinion, or not.
So you're hopeful that there's not going to be, we forgot about climate, we forgot about, healthcare, and it's like it maintains its primacy in the years ahead.
I do believe this is a real inflection point in America.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
And I was just going to say, the great thing is there is definitely this positive groundswell that occurs between sustainability folks within a company and sustainability folks within finance. And certainly what financial people are loud and proud about has big impacts within a company. And it's been really fantastic to see many people in the financial world say, you're not getting a free pass on climate change just because of COVID. I mean, I appreciate it because it's job security for me. But we're not getting a free pass. Our big shareholders still want to see us making an impact on climate change. And in some ways, many people have also been saying that COVID is sort of climate change training wheels, because pandemics become a lot more prevalent within a climate changing world. And there's going to be a lot more disruptive events if we do not get the act together and effectively do something on this.
Yeah, there's one thing I think about the COVID crisis as well as our injustice battles now, which is that there is a role for regulation, an important one for government. This is going back to Louis Brandeis also, I think. And can we wait for business to solve these things, or are we talking about the need for serious policies, both on the climate as well as the inequalities?
I think it depends
Definitely
on which
need policies.
issue. You know, and I, by the way, I think you need the public, you need policy, and you need companies, right? All three need to be involved in a meaningful way. And depending upon the issue, which one dominates the answer changes. You know, I firmly believe that in terms of worker rights and in terms of compensation structures, companies aren't going to take the lead on that. They're just not. They're going to pay attention to the local market dynamics for labor. When it comes to environmental solutions, I do think companies, if we can get people paying a price for carbon, right, that is traded effectively, I think companies will step up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
Carly, what's your
if I
thought?
can just,
Yeah.
if I can just comment, get on the tail of that carbon piece. I think companies are doing a lot. There's 800 companies along with Hershey who have committed to setting a science-based greenhouse gas reduction goal. But it's, even though you have that many companies who are doing it, and that number seems to be growing exponentially, we need governments to act. Really, I think climate change, and this is me personally, not speaking for any of the groups that I am affiliated with, but I personally think that climate change will always remain an issue. And this is my econ background at Brandeis, until you price the externality. And companies have set prices for carbon. So Microsoft has a price on carbon. ExxonMobil, surprisingly enough, has a price on carbon. But it doesn't mean anything unless it is sort of what Rob said, that universal price that is set by a governmental organization.
Yeah.
Or traded on the open market.
Yeah. So, I mean, there is a question here, and
And sorry, but
yeah, go ahead.
I don't mean to belabor this point,
No.
but you know, you think about solar electricity, right? 72%, first of all new utility scale power projects are alternative energy in the coming 2 years. And that's because the price of energy, whether it's solar, wind, geothermal, is somewhere between 6 and 9 cents a kilowatt hour at utility scale. That's actually highly competitive, if not cheaper, than traditional carbon-based sources of energy. And it's certainly cheaper than coal, right? So there's 2 points to be made there. One is we needed government support to get to scale in the solar industry, no doubt about it. But guess what? Now we've got a new industry that is actually cheaper than traditional forms of energy. So anyone who opposes it sort of doesn't understand two things. One is just the economics of the power sector. And two is the idea that something like 60,000 people in America work in the coal industry, which is far less than the number of people who work in the solar industry.
Well, I mean, economic forces hopefully will also lead us in the right direction, but with pricing those externalities is a key part, I suppose, of getting that right. We're out of time. There are many questions that I hope we will be able to get back to those who ask questions. We'll try to respond to them. This presentation will become available through Brandeis as a recording. But let me ask both of you to give us some parting thoughts here. In terms of what can we hope for in a realistic way in the near future that will improve our predicament on environment, on social, and almost on the societal governance we're in. So, open question for you to give us a parting shot.
Carly.
That's a big question of what can we hope for. I mean, I'm a fatalistic optimist, and so I feel like I'm at risk of saying something that is probably too pie in the sky. So rather than answer that, I think I'd like to end on something a bit more practical. There was the question of what can consumers do, and I think, you know, in thinking that, we were thinking of when I go to a store and I buy XYZ good. But the other thing that everyone on this phone call is you're likely probably an investor. You probably have a 401k. Potentially you have your own fund that you're actively investing. And that's another important pot where you can vote with your dollars. And so I would say, think about ESG as you're investing. Ask your fund manager, if you're not managing your own money, how they're voting your proxies on your behalf. Reallocate capital to ESG funds, go into impact investing funds, and engage your employer to get an SRI option in your 401k. There's so many options that you have at your disposal to touch these issues and employ more dollars towards environmental and social means than you might readily recognize.
Thank you. Very, very practical, and because of that, very hopeful in its own way. So thank you, Carly. Rob.
I would agree with what Carly said, particularly the point about allocating capital. You know, it used to be the widely held view that you had to expect some sort of return that was subpar in order to be a socially conscious investor. I will tell you that this year, which has been the worst year in the capital markets that we've seen, I think, at least since the Great Depression, we've made money every single month, a positive return every month. And it's because of the kinds of companies that we look at, and it's because of the way that we focus on those companies. So you absolutely should be thinking carefully about where you're directing your capital, not only because it's your values, but because it's potentially a rewarding place to be. As far as, you know, what do we have to look forward to? I would think back, you know, over the course of history. In 1977, the Sullivan Principles were promoted by General Motors as a way to conduct business in South Africa. General Motors, right? That led essentially to 125 companies in America supporting these principles, and spurred along the way to the apartheid movement. So being active at a corporate level and demanding more from companies, I think, is something that is very real and very durable. And I would say that what we have to look ahead from there is an acceleration of awareness, and certainly an acceleration of the movement. I mean, I've been doing this for about 15 years now, and I've never seen so much serious thought and so much serious analytics going into any kind of investment process. And I think Carly would probably agree that the amount of thought and care that's going into corporate understanding of these issues and response to these issues has never been higher. So I'm actually highly optimistic about the future and where we're headed.
Well, terrific. On that note, we're out of time. We start our classes on time. We end our classes on time, and we thank both of you. I mean, I knew, you know, you were going to be total experts in this stuff, which you are, and you brought it to us, and you brought it to our audience. And I hope our audience learned from this, and certainly hope that we can continue to engage with our alums. This was a conversation that Brandeis would be proud of. Brandeis as a university would be proud of. We would love to have you in person to do this in person next time. But in the meantime, we are online, and we continue to try to reach out to everybody. Thank you. Carly, thank you. And continued good luck in your work, your great work. And Rob, thank you, and continued good work for you in all that you do for Brandeis. I know that you do that too. So thank you all. Audience, please be safe, be well. And it's been a real pleasure for us to be with you this afternoon, this evening. And I think I'm just going to, Allison, I think I'm just going to shut it off, right? Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you, Rob. Thank you,
Thanks for
Carly.
tuning in.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Ben. Bye, Rob.